Jesse kneels between the twin ranchers, trembling as Colt grips his jaw with bruising force. "You're going to take every inch while my brother claims you from behind." The command echoes through the bedroom. This is the test that will either destroy him or make him whole. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The dust never settled in Kettleman County. It hung in the air like secrets, coating everything in a fine red powder that got into your lungs and made breathing feel like swallowing fire. Jesse Marsh had been working the McAllister Ranch for 3 weeks when he learned that some truths were better left buried beneath that dust. The twins owned everything the eye could see: 14,000 acres of prime grazing land, 200 head of cattle, and a reputation that stretched clear to the territorial capital. Colt and Carter McAllister stood 6'4" in their boots, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and voices that could make a grown man's knees buckle. They were identical in every way that mattered, save for one thing. Colt wore his authority like a second skin, while Carter wore his like a weapon. Jesse had come to the ranch with nothing but the clothes on his back and a desperate need for work that paid in something other than promises. At 19, he was lean and wiry, with hands that knew hard labor and eyes that had seen too much too young. The twins had looked him over like they were appraising horseflesh, their gazes moving slow and deliberate across every inch of him, until Jesse felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the blistering sun. "You ever worked cattle before?" Colt had asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Jesse's chest. "Some," Jesse had answered, keeping his eyes down the way he'd learned to do around men with power. "Some ain't good enough on this ranch," Carter had said, stepping closer until Jesse could smell leather and sweat and something else, something that made his pulse quicken in his throat. "We need men who can follow orders without question, men who understand their place." Jesse had swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "I'm a fast learner." The twins had exchanged a look then, something passing between them that Jesse couldn't read, but felt in the pit of his stomach like a warning, or maybe a promise. "We'll see about that," Colt had said finally, and Jesse had the distinct impression that they weren't just talking about cattle. That first night in the bunkhouse, the other ranch hands had warned him. "Stay clear of the twins when they're together," old Miguel had said, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "They got ways of testing a man that ain't natural. Ways that break you down until you don't know which way is up." But Jesse needed the work. Needed it bad enough that he'd swallowed his questions and his pride and reported to the main barn at dawn like he'd been told. The days fell into a brutal rhythm. Up before the sun, working until his hands bled, falling into his bunk with muscles screaming and thoughts he couldn't quite shake loose. The twins were everywhere and nowhere, appearing at random moments to watch him work with eyes that felt like brands against his skin. They never touched him, never said anything that crossed a clear line, but Jesse felt their attention like a physical weight. It was the small things that got under his skin. The way Colt would correct his grip on a rope, standing close enough that Jesse could feel the heat radiating off his body. The way Carter would hand him a canteen of water after a long day, fingers brushing just a fraction too long to be accidental. The way they both looked at him during meals, their expressions unreadable but intense enough to make Jesse's food turn to ash in his mouth. "You're doing good work," Colt had said one evening, catching Jesse alone in the tack room. The space suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. "Carter and we've been discussing your potential." Jesse had kept his eyes on the saddle he was cleaning, his hands moving automatically even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Just trying to earn my keep, sir." "Sir," Colt had repeated the word like he was tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth. "I like that. Shows respect. Shows you understand the natural order of things." Jesse had felt the man move closer, felt the shift in the air that meant Colt was right behind him now, close enough that if Jesse leaned back even slightly, they'd be touching. "There's respect," Colt had continued, his voice dropping lower, "and then there's obedience. You understand the difference?" Jesse had found his voice failing him, his throat tight with something he didn't want to name. "Respect is what you give because you choose to," Colt had said, and Jesse had felt breath against his neck, warm and deliberate. "Obedience is what you give because you have no choice, because you've been broken down and built back up in a shape that serves someone else's purpose." Jesse's hands had stilled on the leather, his whole body tensed like a wire pulled taut. "Which one are you offering, Jesse?" Before Jesse could answer, Carter's voice had cut through the tension like a knife. "Colt, barn, now." The presence behind Jesse had withdrawn so quickly it left him dizzy. He'd heard the brothers' boots on the wooden floor, heard the barn door slam, and only then had he let himself breathe again. That night, lying in his bunk with the sounds of the other hands snoring around him, Jesse had tried to convince himself to leave, pack his few belongings and disappear before dawn, before whatever game the twins were playing with him reached its inevitable conclusion. But when morning came, his feet had carried him back to the barn, back to the work, back to the weight of their watching eyes. The breaking point came on a Saturday, 3 weeks into his employment. The other hands had ridden into town for their weekly drinking and gambling, but Jesse had stayed behind, claiming exhaustion. In truth, he'd been afraid of what might happen if he left the relative safety of numbers. He'd been mucking out stalls when he'd heard them. The twins, their voices carrying across the barn in an argument that made Jesse freeze in place. "He's not ready," Carter was saying, his tone sharp with frustration. "You're pushing too hard, too fast." "You're the one who wanted him," Colt had shot back. "You're the one who looked at that skinny kid and saw exactly what he could become." "What we could make him become," Carter had corrected. "Together, but you're treating this like another conquest, like another way to prove you're the dominant one." Jesse had heard something slam, wood against wood. His hands had tightened on the pitchfork handle. "I'm treating this," Colt had said, his voice deadly quiet, "like an investment. We break him our way together, and we have exactly what we need. Someone loyal, someone grateful, someone who understands that everything he has, everything he is on this ranch, exists because we allow it. And if he breaks wrong, if he runs, he won't run. Did you see the way he looked when you handed him that canteen yesterday? Did you see how his hands shook?" A pause, then Carter's voice softer now. "He's scared. He's awakening. There's a difference." Jesse had backed away from the stall, his pulse roaring in his ears. He'd known he should leave, should get as far from this barn and these men as his legs could carry him. But his feet had stayed rooted to the spot, his whole body frozen in a terrible understanding. They were talking about him, about breaking him, about shaping him into something that served their purposes, their needs, their desires. And the worst part, the part that made Jesse's stomach churn with shame and confusion, was the small voice in the back of his mind, whispering that he wanted to stay and see what came next. The barn door had opened then, flooding the space with late afternoon light. Jesse had looked up to find both twins silhouetted in the doorway, their expressions unreadable against the glare. "Jesse," Colt had said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that sent ice and fire racing through Jesse's veins in equal measure. "We need to talk about your future here, about what we expect, about what you're willing to give." Jesse had swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. "I'm listening." The twins had stepped inside, and as the barn door swung shut behind them, cutting off the light and leaving Jesse in shadow with two men who looked at him like he was something to be claimed, he'd understood with perfect clarity that everything was about to change. "Good," Carter had said, his voice soft as velvet and sharp as a blade, "because there are some lessons that can only be taught a certain way, some truths that can only be learned through surrender. And some tests," Colt had added, moving closer with predatory grace, "that you either pass completely or fail so badly there's no coming back from it." Jesse had stood his ground, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. He'd lifted his chin, met their eyes, and heard himself say the words that would seal his fate. "What kind of test?" The twins had smiled then, identical expressions of satisfaction that made Jesse's blood run cold and hot all at once. "The kind that shows us exactly who you are underneath all that stubborn pride," Colt had said. "The kind that strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself and leaves only truth." "Strip is right," Carter had murmured, and there was dark humor in his voice that made Jesse's knees weak. But we'll start with something simpler, something to show us you're serious about staying, about earning your place here. Colt had reached out then, his hand moving toward Jesse's face, and Jesse had held perfectly still, as rough fingers had traced the line of his jaw with surprising gentleness. "We own this land," Colt had said quietly. "We own every animal on it, every blade of grass, every drop of water. And if you stay, if you accept what we're offering, we'll own you too, completely, without reservation or hesitation." "And in return," Carter had added, his own hand coming up to rest heavy and warm on Jesse's shoulder, "you'll have protection, security, a place where you'll never have to wonder where your next meal comes from or whether you'll freeze come winter. All you have to do," Colt had finished, his thumb brushing across Jesse's lower lip in a gesture that felt both threatening and intimate, "is trust us, obey us, give us everything we ask for, without question or complaint." Jesse had found himself trembling, caught between the two massive men like a rabbit between wolves. His voice had come out barely above a whisper. "And if I can't, then you leave," Carter had said simply. "Tonight, with nothing but what you came with, and you don't come back." The choice had hung in the air between them, heavy as the summer heat. Jesse had thought about the winter that was coming, about the empty roads and emptier prospects. He'd thought about the way the twins looked at him, like he was something precious and terrible all at once. And he'd thought about the part of himself that had awakened under their attention, the part that whispered yes, even as his conscious mind screamed danger. "I'll stay," he'd heard himself say. I'll do what you ask." The twins had exchanged another of those loaded looks, communication passing between them in ways Jesse couldn't track. "Good," Colt had said, his hand dropping away from Jesse's face. "Then we start tomorrow, dawn, main house. And Jesse?" "Yes, sir." "Come hungry. You're going to need your strength for what comes next." They'd left him then, walking out of the barn side by side, there, shadows merging into one as they moved through the doorway. Jesse had stood alone in the gathering darkness, his heart hammering and his hands shaking, wondering what exactly he'd just agreed to. That night, sleep had been impossible. Jesse had lain awake, listening to the wind howl across the plains and the timbers of the bunkhouse creak. He'd told himself a dozen times that he'd leave at first light, that no job was worth whatever the twins had planned. But when dawn had come, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Jesse had found himself walking toward the main house with steady steps. His stomach had been tight with nerves, his palms sweating despite the cool morning air, but his feet had carried him forward anyway. The twins had been waiting on the porch, both of them dressed in work clothes that somehow made them look even more imposing. They'd watched him approach with expressions that gave away nothing. "Glad you came," Carter had said, though his tone suggested he'd never doubted Jesse would show. "We have work to do," Colt had added. "Important work, the kind that requires complete trust and absolute obedience." Jesse had stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at them. "What kind of work?" "The kind that breaks a man down to his foundation," Colt had said, "and builds him back up stronger, more useful, more pliable." "We're going to test your limits," Carter had continued. "Find out exactly how much you can take, how much you can endure before you either break completely or become something greater than you were." Jesse had felt his mouth go dry, his heart racing so fast he thought it might burst from his chest. "I don't understand." "You will," Colt had promised, descending the steps with predatory grace. "By the time we're done with you, you'll understand everything. You'll understand exactly what it means to belong to us, to serve us, to surrender every last piece of yourself until there's nothing left but what we've chosen to keep." Carter had joined his brother, the two of them forming a wall of muscle and intent that made Jesse feel small and vulnerable and strangely electrified all at once. "Last chance to run," Carter had said softly. "Last chance to pretend you don't want this, don't need this, don't crave it in ways that scare you." Jesse had opened his mouth to deny it, to claim he was only staying for the money and the security. But the words had died in his throat, because they would have been a lie, and somehow he'd known the twins would have seen right through them. "I'm not running," he'd said instead, his voice steady despite the tremors running through his body. "No," Colt had agreed, reaching out to grip Jesse's shoulder with bruising force. "You're not. You're going to stand here and take everything we give you, every test, every trial, every moment of sweet torment, until you're remade in our image. "Until you're ours," Carter had finished, his hand coming up to cup the back of Jesse's neck, his grip firm and possessive. "Completely and utterly ours." And as they'd led him into the house, into whatever waited beyond that threshold, Jesse had felt the last of his resistance crumble away like dust in the wind, leaving only a desperate, terrified, exhilarated acceptance of whatever came next. The interior of the main house was nothing like Jesse had expected. He'd imagined rough timber and utilitarian furniture, the kind of sparse bachelor quarters that most ranchers kept. Instead, he found himself in a space that spoke of wealth and careful cultivation. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and thick carpets muffled their footsteps as the twins led him deeper into the house. They brought him to a study, a room dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Colt moved to stand behind the desk, while Carter closed the door with deliberate slowness, the click of the latch sounding final as a coffin lid. "Sit," Colt commanded, gesturing to a chair positioned directly in front of the desk. Jesse sat, his spine rigid, his hands gripping his knees to keep them from shaking. The twins studied him in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The weight of their combined attention made it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything except the pounding of his own heart. "Do you know why we hired you, Jesse?" Carter asked finally, moving to lean against the desk beside his brother. The casual stance did nothing to diminish the intensity in his eyes. "Because you needed hands for the ranch?" Jesse offered, hating how uncertain his voice sounded. Colt shook his head slowly. "We always need hands. The ranch is big. The work never ends. But we could have hired any of the 24 men who came looking for work that week. Stronger men, more experienced men. Men who wouldn't have trembled when we looked at them." Jesse felt heat flood his face. "I wasn't trembling." "You were," Carter said softly. "You are now. And that's exactly why we chose you. Because underneath all that stubborn pride, underneath that desperate need to prove yourself, you were already halfway to understanding what we wanted." "What do you want?" Jesse asked, the question coming out barely above a whisper. The twins exchanged that look again, that silent communication that made Jesse feel like an outsider, watching something intimate and exclusive. "We want someone who understands his place," Colt said. "Someone who knows that in this world, there are those who lead and those who follow, those who command and those who obey. We want someone who can surrender without resentment, who can submit without losing themselves entirely. We want loyalty that goes beyond a paycheck," Carter added. "Trust that goes deeper than a contract. We want someone who will stand between us and the world, knowing that we'll always protect." "What's ours?" Jesse's throat felt tight. "And you think I'm that person?" "We think you could be," Colt said, "if you're willing to let us shape you into it, if you're willing to endure what needs to be endured to get there." Carter pushed away from the desk, circling around the chair until he stood behind Jesse. Jesse felt the man's presence like heat against his back, felt the way his own body tensed and yielded all at once. "The first lesson," Carter said, his voice close to Jesse's ear, "is learning to stay still when every instinct tells you to run, learning to trust that we won't destroy you, even when it feels like we might." Jesse gripped his knees harder, his knuckles going white. He could feel Carter's breath against his neck, could sense Colt watching from behind the desk with those unreadable eyes. "The second lesson," Colt continued, "is learning to ask for what you need instead of waiting for it to be given. Learning to voice your desires, your fears, your limits. Because we can't shape you properly if we don't know what we're working with." "I don't..." Jesse started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. "Don't what?" Carter prompted, his hand coming to rest on Jesse's shoulder, heavy and warm through the fabric of his shirt. "I don't know what I want," Jesse admitted, the words coming out strangled. "I just know I need this job, need a place to be." "That's a start," Colt acknowledged, "but it's not enough. Not for what we're offering, not for what we're asking in return." Carter's hand moved from Jesse's shoulder to the back of his neck, fingers pressing against the tense muscles there. It wasn't quite a caress, wasn't quite a threat, but something suspended perfectly between the two. "Let me tell you what we see when we look at you," Carter said quietly. "We see a young man who's been running from something, maybe from someone. A young man who's learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut because that's how he survived. We see fear, yes, but we also see strength, the kind of strength that comes from enduring what would break lesser men. We see potential," Colt added, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "Raw and unformed, but there. The potential to become exactly what we need, what this ranch needs. Someone who can be trusted with our secrets, our vulnerabilities, our darker appetites." Jesse's breath caught at those last words. What kind of appetites? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Carter's hand tightened slightly on Jesse's neck, not painfully, but enough to make his meaning clear. "The kind that can't be satisfied by the normal order of things," Carter said. "The kind that requires someone who can handle intensity without breaking. Someone who can surrender control and find freedom in that surrender rather than shame." Jesse felt dizzy, his thoughts spinning. He knew he should stand up, walk out, put distance between himself and these men who spoke of ownership and surrender like they were discussing livestock. But his body refused to move, rooted to the chair by something deeper than fear, darker than simple need. "I've never," Jesse started, then stopped again, unsure how to articulate what he'd never done, never been, never allowed himself to want. "We know," Colt said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "That's the beauty of it. You come to us unformed, untaught. We get to shape you from the beginning, mold you into exactly what we need, without having to break bad habits or erase another man's mark." "But make no mistake," Carter said, his hand sliding from Jesse's neck to his shoulder, then down his arm in a slow, deliberate path that made Jesse's skin prickle with sensation. "We will mark you. By the time we're done, everyone who looks at you will know you belong to us. We'll see it in the way you move, the way you speak, the way you hold yourself." Jesse closed his eyes, fighting the wave of sensation that threatened to overwhelm him. When he opened them again, Colt was standing directly in front of him, having moved around the desk with that predatory silence that seemed to be second nature to both brothers. "Stand up," Colt commanded, and Jesse found himself obeying before his conscious mind had fully processed the order. He stood and immediately understood how deliberate the positioning had been. Colt stood directly in front of him, close enough that Jesse had to tilt his head back to meet the man's eyes. Carter remained behind him, his presence a solid warmth against Jesse's back. Trapped between them, Jesse felt his pulse hammer in his throat, felt sweat begin to bead along his spine despite the cool morning air. "This is how it will be," Colt said, his voice low and commanding. "We give the orders, you follow them. We set the pace, you match it. We push, you yield. But in return, we protect what's ours. We provide. We ensure that you never want for anything we have the power to give. And we always reward obedience," Carter added, his hands coming to rest on Jesse's hips, holding him in place. "Just as we always punish defiance, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because the dynamic we're building here requires absolute trust on both sides." Jesse found his voice, though it came out shakier than he would have liked. "What happens if I can't do what you're asking? If I'm not strong enough?" "Then we'll know," Colt said simply, "and we'll find someone who is. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think underneath all that uncertainty, you're exactly as strong as you need to be. You just haven't been given permission to show it yet." Carter's hands tightened on Jesse's hips. "We're giving you that permission now. Permission to be weak when you need to be, to ask for help when you're drowning, to surrender when the fight becomes too much, but also permission to be strong in ways you've never allowed yourself, to want things you've been taught to be ashamed of, to need things that society says are wrong." The words washed over Jesse like a flood. Too much information, too many implications, too many promises wrapped up in warnings. His head spun with it all, his body caught between the desire to lean into the solid warmth of the men surrounding him and the urge to bolt for the door and never look back. "I need time," Jesse heard himself say, "to think about this, to understand what I'm agreeing to." "No," Colt said, and the single word fell between them like a stone. "That's the old way of thinking. The way that says you have the luxury of time, of careful consideration, of weighing your options. But you don't. You made your choice when you walked through that door. Now you live with it." "But we're not unreasonable," Carter said, his voice softer, almost soothing. "We understand that trust takes time, that surrender doesn't happen all at once. So we'll start small, simple tests, easy obedience, and we'll build from there, layer by layer, until you're ready for more." Colt reached out, his hand cupping Jesse's jaw with surprising gentleness. "First test," he said. "Look at me. Don't look away, no matter what you feel, no matter how exposed it makes you. Just hold my gaze and let me see everything you're trying to hide." Jesse wanted to close his eyes, to duck his head, to do anything but meet that intense stare. But Carter's hands on his hips held him steady, and something deeper than fear or pride made him lift his chin and lock eyes with Colt. The moment stretched, seconds becoming minutes, becoming an eternity of being seen, truly seen, in ways Jesse had never allowed before. Colt's eyes seemed to pierce through every defense, every carefully constructed wall, exposing the raw need and desperate longing that Jesse had spent years learning to hide. "There you are," Colt murmured, and Jesse felt something crack open in his chest at the satisfaction in those words. "There's the real Jesse Marsh, the one who's been locked away behind fear and shame and the desperate need to survive." Tears pricked at Jesse's eyes, and he blinked hard, trying to force them back. But one escaped anyway, tracking down his cheek in a warm trail that felt like surrender made visible. Carter's voice came from behind him, quiet but firm. "Don't hide it. Let it come. Tears aren't weakness, Jesse. They're honesty, and we value honesty above almost everything else." So Jesse let them fall, silent tears that spoke of years of holding everything in, of being strong because he had no choice, of wanting things he'd never dared to name. And the twins held him between them, steady and immovable, as he shook with the force of emotions he'd kept buried for too long. When the storm passed, Jesse felt hollowed out and strangely lighter, as though he'd purged something toxic from his system. Colt's thumb brushed away the last tear from his cheek, the gesture almost tender. "Good," Colt said. "That's very good. You passed the first test. Now let's see how you do with the second." The door had closed behind them with a sound like a judgment, and Jesse's old life had ended. What began in its place was something he had no words for yet, something that would either destroy him or transform him into something unrecognizable. Either way, there was no going back now. The second test came in the form of a simple command: work. But nothing about the McAllister ranch was simple, and Jesse learned that quickly in the days that followed his morning in the study. The twins sent him to the far pastures, where the work was hardest and the sun beat down with merciless intensity. They sent him to mend fences that stretched for miles, to break horses that had never felt a saddle, to haul water and chop wood until his hands bled and his muscles screamed. And through it all, they watched. Not always visibly. Sometimes Jesse would go hours without seeing either twin, would begin to think he'd been forgotten, relegated back to being just another ranch hand. But then he'd turn and find one of them on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, perfectly still as they observed his every movement. Or he'd return to the bunkhouse to find a note on his pillow, just a few words in bold handwriting. "You worked well today. We're pleased." Or sometimes, "You favored your left side in the afternoon, injury or laziness." The notes made Jesse's skin prickle with awareness. They saw everything, noticed everything. No detail was too small to escape their attention. No moment of weakness went unrecorded. Miguel had been right to warn him. The twins had ways of getting under a man's skin, of making him hyper-aware of every action, every choice, every breath. Jesse found himself working harder than he ever had, pushing through pain and exhaustion not because he was told to, but because he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them. And that realization, when it came to him one evening as he collapsed into his bunk, terrified him more than anything else. He'd spent 3 weeks on this ranch, and already they'd reshaped something fundamental in him. Already he measured his worth by their approval, judged his actions by their standards. Already he was becoming what they wanted him to be, and the worst part was how natural it felt, how right, like a key finally finding its lock. The other ranch hands noticed the change too. They gave him wider berths now, spoke to him less freely. Jesse caught their glances, heard their whispered conversations that cut off when he drew near. They knew he was different, marked in some way that set him apart. One night, Miguel pulled him aside after dinner, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "You still have time to leave, boy," the old hand said quietly, "before it goes too far, before they own you in ways you can't come back from." Jesse had wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand details about what happened to the men who came before him. But fear had sealed his throat, and Miguel had walked away before Jesse could force the words out. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in his bunk, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, and wondered what exactly he was becoming. The answer came 3 days later. Jesse was in the breaking pen, working with a bay mare that had more spirit than sense. The horse fought him at every turn, rearing and snorting and doing everything in her considerable power to throw him off. Jesse had been at it for hours, sweat soaking through his shirt, his arms aching from the constant battle for control. He didn't hear the twins approach. One moment he was alone with the horse, and the next they were both standing at the fence, watching with identical expressions of focused intensity. The mare chose that moment to make her most violent attempt at freedom, twisting her body in a way that sent Jesse flying. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a moment he just lay there, stunned and gasping, the world spinning above him. Then hands were on him, strong and sure, pulling him upright. Colt on one side, Carter on the other, supporting his weight as the dizziness passed. "Easy," Carter murmured, his voice close to Jesse's ear. "Breathe, just breathe." Jesse did, drawing in great lungfuls of air as his vision cleared. The mare had retreated to the far side of the pen, watching them with wary eyes. "You've been at this too long," Colt said, and there was something in his tone that Jesse couldn't quite identify. "Pushing too hard, trying to prove something." "I can finish," Jesse protested, trying to pull away from their supporting hands. "I just need a minute." "No," Carter said, and his grip tightened, holding Jesse in place. "What you need is to learn the difference between strength and stupidity, between perseverance and self-destruction." They led him out of the pen, ignoring his protests, and brought him to the water trough. Colt filled a tin cup and pressed it into Jesse's hands, while Carter checked him over for injuries with efficient, impersonal touches that somehow felt more intimate than any caress. "Nothing broken," Carter announced finally, "but you're going to be sore tomorrow, bruised." "I've had worse," Jesse muttered, drinking the water more to have something to do with his hands than because he was thirsty. "That's not the point," Colt said, and now Jesse could identify the emotion in his voice. Anger. But not the hot, explosive kind. This was cold and controlled, all the more frightening for its restraint. "The point is that you're our responsibility now, our property, and we don't allow our property to damage itself through recklessness." The word property sent a strange thrill through Jesse's chest, equal parts offense and something darker he didn't want to examine too closely. "I'm not your property," he said, but the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. Carter laughed, a low sound that raised the hairs on the back of Jesse's neck. "No? Then what are you, Jesse? Another ranch hand who just happens to work here? Another transient who'll drift away when the season changes?" Jesse faltered because he didn't know how to finish that sentence truthfully. "You've been sleeping in our bunkhouse," Colt continued, moving closer until Jesse had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "Eating our food, wearing clothes we provided when yours wore out, taking orders without question, measuring your worth by our approval. And you've been happy," Carter added softly, and those words landed like a blow. "Haven't you? For the first time in years, you've had purpose, Structure. Someone who notices when you're hurting and cares enough to make you stop. Jesse wanted to deny it, but the truth stuck in his throat like a bone. He had been happy, in a strange, intense way that bore no resemblance to any happiness he'd known before. "Come with us," Colt said, and it wasn't a request. "It's time for the next lesson." They brought him back to the main house, but not to the study this time. Instead, they led him upstairs, to a part of the house Jesse had never seen. The hallway was lined with closed doors, and Jesse's imagination ran wild with what might lie behind them. Colt opened one door and gestured Jesse inside. The room was simple but comfortable, dominated by a large bed with clean linens and a window that looked out over the endless prairie. A wash basin stood in one corner and a wardrobe against the far wall. "This is your room now," Carter said, watching Jesse's face. "We're moving you out of the bunkhouse. You'll take your meals with us, sleep here, spend your evenings in the house rather than with the other hands." Jesse felt panic flutter in his chest. "Why? What did I do wrong?" "Nothing wrong," Colt assured him, though his expression remained serious. "Everything right. You've proven yourself these past weeks. Shown us that you can endure, that you can be shaped into what we need. So we're taking the next step." "Which is?" Jesse asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Integration," Carter said simply. "You're no longer just a ranch hand. You're becoming part of the household, part of our private world, and that means new rules, new expectations, new levels of intimacy and trust." The word intimacy hung in the air like smoke. Jesse's pulse hammered in his throat as he looked between the twins, trying to read their intentions in their impassive faces. "I don't understand what you want from me," Jesse admitted, the confession coming out barely above a whisper. Colt stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup Jesse's jaw. The touch was firm but not rough, possessive but not cruel. "We want your loyalty, your obedience, your trust. We want you to stop fighting what you feel. Stop pretending you don't want this as much as we do." "And in return," Carter said, moving to stand behind Jesse, bracketing him between their bodies, "we'll give you everything. Protection, purpose, a place to belong that goes deeper than employment, a family of sorts, even if it's not the kind the world would understand." Jesse's breath came short and fast. I don't know how to—" "We know," Colt said, his thumb brushing across Jesse's lower lip. "That's why we'll teach you, step by step, layer by layer, until you understand exactly what it means to be ours." "Tonight," Carter said, his hands coming to rest on Jesse's shoulders, "you'll eat dinner with us, properly, at the table, with decent food and conversation, and you'll tell us about yourself, the real story, not the sanitized version you tell strangers. We want to know everything, what you're running from, what you're searching for, what keeps you awake at night." "That's the third test," Colt explained, his hand dropping from Jesse's face. "Honesty, complete and unflinching. No more walls, no more careful omissions. If you're going to be part of this household, part of our lives, we need to know who you really are." Jesse felt stripped bare by their combined attention, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical nakedness. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, something else stirred. Relief maybe, or hope. The possibility that he could finally stop running, stop hiding, stop pretending to be less than he was. "All right," he heard himself say. "I'll tell you, everything." The dinner was unlike anything Jesse had experienced. The twins had set the long dining table with actual china and silverware, had prepared food that bore no resemblance to the basic fare served in the bunkhouse. Roasted meat and fresh vegetables, bread that was still warm, wine in crystal glasses that caught the lamplight. Jesse sat between them, acutely aware of how close they were, how every movement put him in contact with one or both of them. Colt's knee would brush against his under the table. Carter's arm would press against his shoulder as he reached for the wine bottle. Small touches, seemingly accidental, but Jesse knew better by now. Nothing the twins did was accidental. "Start at the beginning," Colt said, cutting into his meat with precise movements. "Where were you born? What was your family like?" So Jesse told them. About growing up in a small town in Kansas, the youngest of 6 children. About a father who drank and a mother who worked herself to death, trying to hold the family together. about brothers who looked at him with disgust when they caught him looking at the farrier's apprentice with too much interest, about the night his oldest brother had cornered him in the barn, had beaten him bloody while calling him names Jesse still flinched to remember. "I left the next morning," Jesse said, his voice flat with the effort of keeping emotion out of it. "Took what money I could find and started walking. I was 15. "And you've been running ever since," Carter said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jesse nodded. "Working whatever jobs I could find. Sleeping in barns or under the stars. Keeping my head down and my mouth shut. Learning to be invisible." "Until you came here," Colt said. "Until I came here," Jesse agreed. "And you saw me anyway, even when I was trying not to be seen." The twins exchanged one of their loaded looks. Then Carter spoke, his voice gentler than Jesse had ever heard it. "We saw you because we recognized something in you. The same thing we see in each other. The need to belong, to be claimed, to surrender the weight of always having to be strong and let someone else carry it for a while. We're not like other men," Colt added. "We don't fit into the neat boxes society wants to put us in. We want things that would get us hanged in some towns, imprisoned in others. We want power and submission, dominance and devotion. We want someone who can be soft with us in private and strong beside us in public. We want you," Carter finished, "not as a ranch hand, not as a charity case, but as ours, completely and utterly ours." Jesse's hands trembled around his wine glass. "And what happens when you get tired of me? When the novelty wears off and you want someone new?" "That's not how this works," Colt said firmly. "We don't do casual, we don't do temporary. When we claim something, we keep it, protect it, value it. You think we would have spent weeks breaking you down and building you back up if we were just going to discard you when we got bored? We're offering you a permanent place here," Carter said. "In this house, in our lives, in our bed, when you're ready for that step. But it has to be your choice, your genuine, uncoerced decision. Because once you say yes, once you truly commit to this, there's no halfway. You're either all in or you're out entirely." The weight of the decision pressed down on Jesse's shoulders. He thought about his life before the ranch, the endless running and hiding, the bone-deep loneliness that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing it. He thought about these past weeks, the intensity and fear and strange exhilaration of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. He thought about the room upstairs, waiting for him, about the way the twins looked at him, like he mattered, like he was precious and dangerous and exactly what they'd been searching for. "I want to say yes," Jesse admitted, his voice shaken. "But I'm terrified of what it means, of what I'm becoming, of how much I already need this, need you, after such a short time." "Fear is natural," Colt said. "Fear means you understand the magnitude of what we're offering. If you weren't afraid, we'd be worried. But fear doesn't have to be a barrier," Carter added. "It can be a bridge, a way of moving from what you were to what you can become. And we'll be there every step of the way, catching you when you fall, pushing you when you hesitate, reminding you that you're not alone anymore." Jesse drew a shaking breath, then another. He thought about Miguel's warning, about the chance to leave before it went too far. But he knew with sudden, brilliant clarity that it had already gone too far. He was already changed, already bound to these men in ways that went deeper than employment or even desire. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff, like cutting the last rope holding him to his old life. "I'm yours, if you'll have me." The twins smiled, identical expressions of satisfaction and possession that made Jesse's blood run hot and cold all at once. "Then it's settled," Colt said, raising his wine glass. "Welcome home, Jesse Marsh." They drank to his surrender, to his transformation, to the new life beginning in that moment. And Jesse felt the last of his resistance melt away, leaving only a fierce, terrified joy. After dinner, the twins showed him the rest of the house. The library, where shelves groaned under the weight of more books than Jesse had ever seen in one place. The parlor, with its comfortable furniture and fireplace. The back porch, where they could sit and watch the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "This is your home now," Carter said as they stood on that porch, the three of them watching nightfall across the land. Every room, every corner. You have the run of the place. The only rooms that are off limits are our private chambers, and that's only until you're ready. Ready for what? Jesse asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Ready to share our bed, Colt said bluntly. Ready to be with us in every way. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. We won't rush you into that. It happens when you're ready, not before. Jesse felt heat flood his face. I've never... We know, Carter said gently, and we'll teach you when the time comes. But for now it's enough that you're here, that you've chosen us. The rest will unfold as it's meant to. They stood in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Jesse felt something loosen in his chest, some knot he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. I have a question, he said finally. Ask, Colt encouraged. Why both of you? Why do you need to share this? Whatever this is? The twins were quiet for a moment. Then Carter spoke, his voice thoughtful. We're twins. We've never been separate, not really. We think together, work together, want the same things. It would feel incomplete, wrong, to have something this important that we didn't share, like cutting ourselves in half. And practically, Colt added, we balance each other. Carter is patient where I'm demanding. I'm decisive where he hesitates. Together we can give you what you need. Separately, we'd only give you half. Besides, Carter said, and Jesse could hear the smile in his voice, you respond to both of us. We've watched you. The way you soften when I speak gently. The way you straighten when Colt gives an order. You need both, just like we need each other. Jesse couldn't argue with that. He had felt it himself, the way the twins complemented each other, the way they created a complete whole that was greater than its parts. Come on, Colt said, turning toward the door. It's late and you've had a long day. Let's get you settled in your new room. They walked him upstairs, stood in the doorway while he took in the space that was now his. Someone, probably Carter given the care involved, had moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse. They sat on the dresser, his spare shirt and the photograph of his mother that he'd managed to keep through all his running. Sleep well, Carter said. Tomorrow starts a new chapter, new work, new expectations, new lessons to learn. But also new joys, Colt added, new freedoms, new ways of being that you never allowed yourself before. They left him then, closing the door softly behind them. Jesse stood in the center of the room, still half expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. But the bed was real, soft when he sank down onto it. The window was real, showing him the vast prairie lit by moonlight. The future stretching ahead of him was real, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He undressed slowly, folding his clothes with care, before slipping between the clean sheets. The bed was larger and more comfortable than anything he'd slept in for years. He should have fallen asleep immediately, exhausted from the day's work and the emotional intensity of the evening. But sleep eluded him. He lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, and thought about what he'd agreed to, what he'd become. He was theirs now. Property, they'd said, but also precious, protected, valued in ways he'd never been valued before. A soft knock at his door made him sit up. "Come in," he called, his voice rough. The door opened to reveal Carter, still fully dressed, carrying a small tray. "Thought you might have trouble sleeping your first night," he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Brought you some warm milk and honey. My mother used to make it for us when we were boys and couldn't settle." Jesse felt something warm bloom in his chest at the gesture, at the glimpse of Carter as a child, rather than the intimidating man he presented to the world. "Thank you," Jesse said softly. Carter sat on the edge of the bed, his weight making the mattress dip. "Are you all right? Truly? No doubts or regrets?" Jesse considered lying, presenting a brave face, but that was the old way of thinking, the way that had kept him alone and hiding for so long. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but also hopeful, I think. I don't know if I'm ready for everything this means, but I know I don't want to go back to how things were before." Carter nodded, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Jesse's forehead. The touch was gentle, almost paternal, and it made Jesse's throat tight with emotion. "That's all we ask," Carter said, "that you keep choosing us. Keep choosing this life, this family we're building. The rest will come in time." "What if I disappoint you?" Jesse whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough or brave enough or whatever enough to be what you need?" "Impossible," Carter said firmly. "You've already proven yourself stronger and braver than you know. Everything else is just details, just learning and growing and becoming more fully yourself." He stood, but before leaving, he bent down and pressed a kiss to Jesse's forehead. It was chaste, almost brotherly, but it carried a weight of promise that made Jesse's breath catch. "Sleep," Carter commanded gently. "Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Face it rested." After he left, Jesse sipped the warm milk, feeling the honey coat his throat and the warmth spread through his chest. He set the empty cup aside and lay back down, pulling the blankets up to his chin. And this time, sleep came easily, pulling him down into dreams of wide open spaces and the knowledge that he was finally, truly home. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Jesse still worked, but now his tasks were different. The twins kept him close, had him help with the books and correspondence, taught him the business side of ranching. He learned about breeding lines and market prices, about negotiating with buyers and managing the other hands. "You need to understand every aspect of this operation," Colt explained one afternoon as they pored over ledgers in the study. "Because eventually, you'll be helping us run it. Not as an employee, but as a partner." The word partner made Jesse's head spin. "I'm 19, he protested. "I don't know anything about running a ranch." "That's why we're teaching you," Carter said, looking up from the letter he was writing. "And you're learning fast, faster than some men twice your age would." It was true. Jesse found that when he wasn't exhausted from physical labor, his mind was sharp and quick. He absorbed information like a sponge, asked questions that showed he was thinking 3 steps ahead, made connections that impressed even the twins. "You've got a good head for this," Colt said one evening, genuine approval in his voice. "Better than we expected. Give you a few years, and you'll be running this place as well as we do." The praise warmed Jesse from the inside out, made him sit a little straighter, work a little harder. He found himself craving their approval the way he'd once craved food and shelter. And the twins gave it freely when earned, but also made clear when he fell short. "Don't get sloppy," Colt would say when Jesse made an error in the books. "Attention to detail matters. Try again." Or Carter would shake his head over a poorly written letter. "This isn't good enough. You're capable of better. Show me." The corrections stung, but never felt cruel. They came from a place of wanting Jesse to improve, to become the best version of himself. And always, when Jesse corrected his mistakes and did the work properly, the twins rewarded him with praise that made his chest tight with pride. The evenings were spent together, the 3 of them in the parlor or on the porch. Sometimes they talked, the twins telling stories of building the ranch from nothing, of the struggles and triumphs that had shaped them. Sometimes they read, companionable silence broken only by the crackle of the fire or the turn of pages. And sometimes they simply sat, enjoying each other's presence without need for words. Jesse learned their rhythms, their moods, their unspoken signals. He learned that Colt liked his coffee black and strong, that Carter had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, that both of them had nightmares sometimes and would be quiet and withdrawn the next morning, until Jesse learned to simply be present without pushing. He learned that they valued honesty above almost everything, that lying or omitting truth was the quickest way to earn their disappointment. He learned that they rewarded initiative but punished recklessness, that they expected him to think for himself, but also to know when to defer to their greater experience. And gradually, so gradually, Jesse almost didn't notice it happening, he learned that he was happy. 6 weeks after moving into the main house, Jesse stood on the back porch watching the sunset and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about running. The urge that had driven him for 4 years, The constant restlessness that said nowhere was safe and no one could be trusted had simply faded. He trusted the twins, trusted that they would keep him safe, that they would value him, that they wouldn't suddenly turn cruel or cast him aside. He belonged here, in this house, on this land, with these men who had taken him apart and put him back together in a shape that finally felt right. "You're smiling," Carter observed, coming to stand beside him. "What are you thinking about?" "That I'm home," Jesse said simply. "Really, truly home for the first time in my life." Carter's hand came to rest on his shoulder, warm and solid and grounding. "Yes," he agreed. "You are." They stood like that, watching the light fade from the sky, and Jesse felt a peace he'd never imagined possible settle into his bones. That night, after dinner, Colt called Jesse into the study. Jesse went willingly, no longer fearing these private conversations, but rather looking forward to them. This was where the twins were most themselves, most willing to speak openly about their thoughts and feelings. Colt stood by the window, looking out at the darkness. When he spoke, his voice was unusually hesitant. "You've been with us for almost 2 months now, proven yourself in every way we asked, shown us that our trust wasn't misplaced." He turned to face Jesse. "The question now is whether you're ready for the next step." Jesse's pulse quickened. "What step?" "Full integration," Colt said. "Not just living in the house, but sharing all aspects of our lives, including the most intimate ones." Jesse's mouth went dry. They'd been patient, giving him time to adjust, to feel safe, but he'd known this conversation was coming eventually. "I don't know if I'm ready," Jesse admitted. "I want to be, but I'm still afraid." "Of what?" Colt asked, moving closer. "Of not being good enough, of not knowing what to do, of disappointing you." Colt reached out, cupping Jesse's face in both hands. "Listen to me very carefully. You could never disappoint us by being inexperienced. We don't expect you to know what you're doing. We expect you to trust us to guide you, to teach you, to show you pleasure you've never imagined." "But what if I can't?" Jesse whispered. "What if my body doesn't cooperate, or I panic, or—" "Then we stop," Colt said firmly. "We're not monsters, Jesse. We don't take what isn't freely given. If you say stop, we stop. No questions, no punishment, no disappointment. This only works if it's something you want, something that brings you joy rather than fear." Jesse drew a shaking breath. "And if I'm not ready tonight? If I need more time?" "Then you take it," Colt said. "We've waited this long. We can wait longer. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about us pressuring you or demanding something you're not ready to give. This is about us opening a door and letting you choose whether to walk through it." Jesse nodded slowly. "Can I think about it? Just for tonight?" "Of course," Colt said, dropping his hands. "Take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready." Jesse fled to his room, his heart hammering and his thoughts in chaos. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to sort through the tangle of fear and desire that churned in his gut. He wanted this, wanted them, wanted to cross that final threshold and become truly theirs in every way. But the fear was real too, born of inexperience and a lifetime of being taught that men like him were wrong, sinful, deserving of punishment. Sleep came eventually, though it was restless and full of half-formed dreams. When morning came, Jesse found himself drawn to the kitchen, where Carter was making breakfast. The man looked up when Jesse entered, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Not really," Jesse admitted. "I've been thinking about what Colt said, about the next step." Carter set down the spatula, giving Jesse his full attention. "And? I'm afraid," Jesse said. "But I'm also tired of being afraid, tired of letting fear rule my life. I trust you, both of you. I trust that you'll take care of me, that you'll stop if I need you to, that you won't hurt me just because you can." "All true," Carter confirmed. Jesse drew a deep breath, gathering his courage. "So yes, I'm ready. Maybe not for everything all at once, but ready to start, ready to see where this goes." Carter's smile widened, and he crossed the kitchen to pull Jesse into a tight embrace. "You've made us very happy," he murmured against Jesse's hair. "We'll make sure you never regret this choice." That evening, after dinner and after the dishes were cleared, the twins led Jesse upstairs. But instead of stopping at his room, they continued down the hall to the door that had always been closed. Their private chambers. Colt opened the door and gestured Jesse inside. The room was larger than Jesse's, dominated by a massive bed piled with soft blankets and pillows. Lamps cast warm light across polished wood and thick rugs. It was masculine but comfortable, a space designed for rest and intimacy in equal measure. "This is where we sleep," Carter said, closing the door behind them. "And starting tonight, when you're ready, it's where you'll sleep too." Jesse's heart hammered as the twins moved closer, bracketing him between their bodies just as they had that first day in the study. But this time, Jesse didn't feel trapped. He felt safe, protected, wanted. "We're going to go slow," Colt said, his hands coming to rest on Jesse's shoulders. "We're going to learn every inch of you, every sound you make, every touch that makes you shiver, and you're going to learn us the same way." "This isn't about conquest," Carter added, his hands settling on Jesse's hips. "It's about connection, about becoming so intertwined that none of us can tell where one ends and the others begin." They moved then, hands and mouths, and whispered words that made Jesse's head spin. They undressed him slowly, reverently, pausing whenever he tensed to give him time to adjust. Colt's hands were rough from years of ranch work, commanding as they mapped every inch of Jesse's trembling form. Carter's touch was gentler, but no less possessive, following in his brother's wake like a promise. "On your knees," Colt commanded, his voice dropping to that tone that made Jesse's legs weak. There was no room for argument in those words, no space for hesitation, just pure authority that demanded obedience. Jesse sank down without thinking, his body responding before his mind could catch up. The hardwood floor was cool against his knees, grounding him even as his head spun with overwhelming sensation. Colt stood before him, massive and commanding, while Carter moved behind Jesse, his presence a solid warmth against his back. Jesse felt caught between them again, but this time there was nowhere to hide, no clothes to shield him, nothing but raw vulnerability and trust. "Look at me," Colt ordered, and Jesse obeyed, tilting his head back to meet those fierce gray eyes. "You're going to learn exactly what it means to serve us, to take what we give you without complaint or resistance." Jesse's breath came in short gasps, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Carter's hands settled on his hips from behind, grip firm and possessive. "Open," Colt said, and the single word carried the weight of everything Jesse had agreed to, everything he'd surrendered. Jesse parted his lips, trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate anticipation. Colt stepped closer, his hand coming up to grip Jesse's jaw with bruising force. "You're going to take every inch," Colt said, his voice rough with need and dominance. "Every single measure of what I'm giving you, and you're going to thank me for it while my brother claims you from behind." The crude reality of what they were demanding slammed into Jesse like a physical blow. His eyes went wide, his whole body tensing with the impossibility of it. "I can't," Jesse gasped, trying to pull back. "It's too much, I can't." "You can," Carter said firmly from behind him, his hands tightening on Jesse's hips. "And you will, because you're ours, and we know exactly how much you can take. We won't break you, Jesse. We'll just push you to edges you didn't know existed." Colt's thumb brushed across Jesse's lower lip, the gesture almost tender despite the crude demands falling from his mouth. "Take me in," he commanded, "all the way. I want to feel you struggle with the fullness, want to hear you choke on how overwhelming it is." Jesse whimpered, but he obeyed, parting his lips wider as Colt guided himself forward. The sensation was immediately overwhelming, stretching Jesse's mouth impossibly wide, pushing deeper than he thought he could manage. He gagged, tears springing to his eyes, but Colt's hand in his hair held him steady. "That's it," Colt growled, his voice tight with satisfaction. "Take it all, every thick inch. Show me how devoted you are." Behind him, Jesse felt Carter positioning himself, felt the pressure building as the man prepared to claim him completely. The dual sensation, being filled from both directions simultaneously, made Jesse's mind white out with overwhelming intensity. "Breathe through it," Carter coached, his voice strained with his own need. "Relax and let us in. Let us take you completely." Jesse tried to obey, tried to relax despite every instinct screaming that this was too much, too intense, too overwhelming. But Carter pushed forward anyway, entering him with steady, relentless pressure that had Jesse crying out around the fullness in his mouth. "Perfect," Colt hissed, his hips rocking forward. "Absolutely perfect. Look at you, taking us both like you were made for this, like your whole purpose is to be filled by us." The words should have been humiliating, should have made Jesse want to flee. Instead, they sent fire racing through his veins, made his body respond in ways that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Carter began to move behind him, each thrust driving Jesse forward onto Colt's demanding hardness. The rhythm built between them, the twins finding their synchronized pace with the ease of people who'd done everything together their whole lives. Jesse was caught in the middle, overwhelmed by sensation from both directions, unable to do anything but surrender to their combined assault. Tears streamed down his face, but they weren't from pain. They were from the sheer intensity of being claimed so thoroughly, of being used and filled and possessed in ways that stripped away every last pretense. "Choke on it," Colt commanded, his voice rough and commanding. "Take every measure I'm giving you while he mounts you from behind. This is what you are now, what you've always been. Ours to fill, ours to use, ours to pleasure however we see fit." The crude words should have broken something in Jesse. Instead, they completed something, as Carter's movements became more urgent behind him, as Colt pushed deeper into his throat until Jesse genuinely couldn't breathe. Something fundamental shifted in Jesse's understanding of himself. This was surrender. True, complete, terrifying surrender. And it was also freedom. His body responded without his conscious choice, accepting what they gave, yielding where they pushed, opening where they demanded entry. The pleasure built to unbearable heights, sensations crashing over him in waves that threatened to drown him. "That's it," Carter groaned, his grip on Jesse's hips bruising in its intensity. "Take us both. Show us how completely you belong to us." Jesse felt himself coming apart, his whole body shaking with the force of sensations he had no words for. He couldn't speak around Colt's demanding fullness, couldn't do anything but whimper and tremble and surrender to the overwhelming reality of being claimed so thoroughly. When the crisis came, it crashed through all three of them simultaneously. Colt's commanding voice broke into a groan of satisfaction. Carter's careful control shattered into desperate need. And Jesse felt himself dissolve entirely, every piece of his old self burning away in the fire of their combined possession. They held him there, filled and trembling and utterly transformed, until the waves of sensation finally began to ebb. Only then did they carefully withdraw, leaving Jesse gasping and shaking on the floor between them. Colt knelt down, cupping Jesse's tear-stained face with surprising gentleness. "You did so well," he murmured, the praise washing over Jesse like a benediction. "So very well. You took everything we gave you and didn't break." Carter gathered Jesse into his arms, lifting him from the floor and carrying him to the bed. "You're magnificent," he whispered against Jesse's hair. "Absolutely magnificent." They cleaned him with warm cloths, their touches now tender and soothing. They held him between them, whispering praise and reassurance until Jesse's trembling subsided. And through it all, Jesse felt something settle deep in his chest, a certainty, a belonging. He'd been tested in the most fundamental way possible, and had emerged not broken, but transformed, remade into something stronger and truer than he'd been before. The night stretched on, measured not in hours, but in discoveries. Jesse learned the taste of their skin, the sounds they made when he touched them just right, the way they moved together with the fluid synchronization of people who had been one before they were two. He learned that surrender could be freedom rather than defeat, that vulnerability could be strength when placed in the right hands. He learned that his body was capable of sensations he'd never dreamed of, that pleasure could build and build until it became almost unbearable before finally cresting in waves that left him shaking and gasping and utterly transformed. And when it was over, When they lay tangled together in the massive bed with Jesse cradled between their warm bodies, he learned that this was what home felt like. Not a place, but a belonging. Not safety from the world, but the courage to face it knowing you weren't alone. "How do you feel?" Carter asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Jesse's spine. Jesse considered the question, taking inventory of his battered emotions and satisfied body. "Whole," he said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel whole." Colt pressed a kiss to his temple. "Good, because you are whole, complete, exactly as you were meant to be." They slept then, the three of them wrapped around each other, and Jesse dreamed of a future that stretched out bright and endless before him. The months that followed were a revelation. Jesse grew into his role as partner rather than property, though the twins still claimed ownership in private moments that made his blood sing. He learned the business of the ranch inside and out, made decisions that affected the operation, earned the respect of the other hands through competence rather than fear. And at night, he came home to the twins, to the room they shared, and the bed where they taught him new ways of being loved. Miguel cornered him one day in the barn, his weathered face serious. "I was wrong about you, boy," the old man said. "Thought they'd break you. Instead, you broke free, became stronger than you were before." Jesse smiled. "They did break me, but they also put me back together better than I was. That's the difference." Miguel nodded slowly. "Just don't forget who you were before, that scared kid who needed help. There'll be others like him, and you'll be the one who decides whether to offer a hand or look away." The words stayed with Jesse, echoing in his mind. And 6 months later, when a young man showed up at the ranch looking for work, hollow-eyed and desperate, Jesse remembered, he brought the boy to the twins, stood beside him as they looked him over with those assessing gazes Jesse knew so well. "He needs a chance," Jesse said quietly. "Like I did." The twins looked at each other, then at Jesse, then back at the nervous youth. "All right," Colt said finally. "We'll give him a chance, under your supervision." And Jesse understood then that this was the final piece of his transformation. He'd been the one who needed saving. Now he was the one who could offer salvation to another lost soul. The cycle would continue, the ranch providing refuge for those who didn't fit anywhere else. And Jesse would be there, helping to guide them, showing them that surrender to the right people could be the path to freedom rather than chains. Years passed. The ranch prospered. Jesse grew from a frightened boy into a confident man, respected by all who knew him. The twins remained constant, the foundation upon which he'd built his new life. And on quiet evenings, when the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Jesse would think back to that first day, to the dusty road and the desperate hope, to the twins who had seen something in him worth cultivating. He'd come to them broken and running, expecting nothing but a paycheck and a place to sleep. Instead, he'd found a home, a family, a love that defied all conventional definitions, but was no less real for its strangeness. "Any regrets?" Carter asked one evening, as though reading his thoughts. Jesse looked at the two men who had claimed him, changed him, made him whole. He thought about the scared boy he'd been, and the man he'd become, about the journey from property to partner, from fearful submission to joyful surrender. "Not a single one," Jesse said honestly. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." And as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Jesse Marsh sat between the two men he loved and felt grateful for the day he'd taken a chance on a ranch that promised nothing but hard work and an uncertain future. Because he'd found so much more than he'd dared to hope for. He'd found himself. The end.